Timothy Borsa, presenting his thesis titled The Effects and Implication of Classical Liberalism in 20th Century America.
Reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will be consulted, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. In the 16th and 17th centuries, thinkers such as Adam Smith, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke, and many more developed some of the first foundations for the classical liberal movement. These thinkers and the rise of constitutional monarchies shaped the political ideology that would ultimately influence the United States Constitution. For the purposes of this discussion, classical liberalism can be defined as a political ideology that limits the purpose and responsibility of government to simply the protection of the rights of man, life, liberty, and property. Today, this term is often confused with the modern term liberal, but these terms are very different. Modern liberalism, rooted in the social liberal movement, emerged much later and represents a different set of ideals, which I'll explain shortly. Today, this term is often confused. There's a general agreement that classical liberalism heavily influenced American politics starting in the 18th century. But there's debate about how later political ideologies, like mid-20th century social liberalism, 19th century conservatism, and late 20th century Reaganism, embody or diverge from classical liberal ideals. Writers such as Adam Smith helped define the classical liberal movement in the 18th century. Smith believed that the government itself must be limited. Its core functions were defense, maintaining order, building infrastructure, and promoting education. He advocated for laissez-faire economics, hands-off government intervention, so that individuals could drive the economy through their self-interests. This concept is what Smith described as the invisible hand. Meanwhile, Thomas Hobbes, writing during the English Civil War, brought forward the concept of the social contract, citizens giving up certain freedoms in exchange for the protection of their core rights. He believed that the government was necessary to prevent conflict among individuals and to maintain peace and order. John Locke, perhaps the most influential classical liberal, also wrote on natural rights. Influenced by England's Glorious Revolution, he argued that life, liberty, and property were inherent rights. If a government failed to protect those rights, Locke said the people had the right to revolt. He wrote, quote, "There remains still in the people a supreme power to remove or alter the legislative when they find the legislative act contrary to the trust reposed in it." So, classical liberalism is best understood as a philosophy that limits government's role to protecting natural rights, promotes individual liberty, supports minimal government interference in the economy, and stresses personal responsibility. Social liberalism, which emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, shares classical liberalism's concern for individual rights, but expands government in ways that classical liberals would have rejected. Economists like Richard Ely and Henry Carter Adams responded to the harsh conditions of the industrialization by advocating for economic reform. Lester Ward criticized laissez-faire economics, writing, "The unrestricted power to adulterate the people's food for gain is guarded as an inalienable right." Social liberalism called for three key reforms: increased government regulation of the economy, expanded access to education, and a shift from equality of opportunity to equality of outcome. President Woodrow Wilson's The New Freedom Reforms and President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal reflected these ideas. Roosevelt's administration introduced massive federal programs, the FDIC, SEC, and Social Security among them, vastly expanding the role of government. Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society continued this expansion with new institutions like Medicare and Medicaid, and legislation targeting poverty, education, and transportation. In short, social liberalism sought to use government as a tool for social progress. Although it shared classical liberalism's concern for the individual, it redefined liberty as freedom from want rather than freedom from government. And that was a major departure from classical liberalism. In contrast, the conservatism of the 1880s preserved much of classical liberalism, especially economically. This movement prioritized limited government, property rights, and personal responsibility. It valued tradition, was skeptical of rapid social change, and sought to preserve the ideals of the founding fathers. Both classical liberalism and conservatism emphasized small government and laissez-faire economics. Conservatives also shared the belief that individual liberty is protected by property rights and a restrained government. John Stuart Mill captured the sentiment, writing, quote, "Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign," end quote. However, differences did exist. While classical liberals were fully committed to free trade, conservatives were more open to tariffs and certain regulations to protect American manufacturing and counter monopolies. Socially, conservatives prioritized maintaining order, even if it meant slowing progress, while classical liberals were more concerned with dismantling unjust systems like aristocracy. By the 1980s, a new conservative movement emerged under President Ronald Reagan. This movement, known as Reaganism, revived many of the ideas of classical liberalism, though not without exception. Reagan believed that, quote, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem, quote. His administration passed significant tax cuts, reduced funding for welfare programs, and supported deregulation. These efforts mirrored the classical liberal belief in minimal government and laissez-faire economics. Reagan's Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 was the first real tax cut for everyone in 20 years. His administration also deregulated sectors such as banking and transportation, allowing for innovation and growth. Socially, Reaganism brought the Republican Party into alignment with traditional values. While classical liberalism didn't focus much on social issues, Reagan's promotion of the nuclear family, Christianity, and patriotism didn't contradict classical liberalism either. However, Reagan did depart from classical liberalism in his military spending. His philosophy of peace through strength led to large defense budgets. Yet, given the Cold War context, one could argue this was a justified deviation from the small government principle, especially since defense fell under the umbrella of government's chief roles. In conclusion, American political movements from the 21st century, social liberalism, 19th century conservatism, and Reaganism, each drew from classical liberalism in different ways. Social liberalism expanded the government's role in ways that classical liberals would have rejected, who claimed it was necessary for true liberty. 19th century conservatism largely preserved classical liberal ideals, but made practical compromises. Reaganism revived classical liberalism's economic principles, though with added emphasis on social values and military strength. Each movement interpreted classical liberalism through its own lens and in the context of its time. Understanding how these ideologies embraced or abandoned classical liberal principles help us navigate political questions today, particularly those about government's proper role and the nature of liberty.